With the GameCube's library slowly being made playable on the Switch too, we thought now would be a good time to revisit some of the system's most iconic games. From Wind Waker to Metroid Prime, Kirby Air Ride, Animal Crossing, F-Zero GX, and more. GameCube was one of Nintendo's best consoles, but at only 22 million units sold, it's also one of its worst selling. It's weird to think about, but it's possible more people will experience GameCube on Switch 2 than ever did on its original hardware. As usual, we translated a bunch of old Japanese magazines and interviews looking for rare trivia for this video, but we'll keep the intro short and get right to it. In 2003, Nintendo Dream magazine interviewed Wind Waker's composer Koji Kondo and HAL Labs composer Shogo Sakai, who worked on Smash Melee and Kirby Air Ride. Sakai interrupts the interview at one point to ask Kondo, why did you make Link hold the Wind Waker baton in his left hand? Kondo's like, well, Link's left-handed. He always holds his sword in his left hand. So what? Well, Sakai frequently flies to Europe for opera and concerts, and says real-life conductors never hold the baton in their dominant hand, meaning Link should have held the Wind Waker in his right hand, not his left. Apparently, no one on the Zelda team knew that, and Sakai kinda breaks their balls over it here. Kondo says he's not as much of an orchestra head, and that in middle school, he was more into playing Deep Purple covers in his garage band. As a matter of fact, you can hear Deep Purple's influence in some of the music he makes for Nintendo. You can draw a straight line from Deep Purple all the way to Wind Waker 30 years later. Kondo was about to list more bands after Deep Purple, but Sakai cut him off mid-sentence, which is unfortunate because we would have liked to hear more influences. But yeah, maybe Kondo not being so much into orchestra led to Link holding the baton in the wrong hand, but the music itself more than made up for it. Elsewhere in that same magazine, Sakurai talks about how hard it was to make Kirby Air Ride. It started out as an N64 game revealed at Space World 95, 8 years before its release. It took several different forms till eventually it got cancelled, then rebooted as an entirely different project on GameCube, which Sakurai says isn't the same game at all, except the title and the fact Kirby rides a star. Even after starting over though, the next year yielded few results, and the game continued to flounder in development hell. Eventually, he was able to finish it in 2003 with a soundtrack that had taken even more work than his previous game. Smash Melee took 3 composers 8 months, while Air Ride took just as long with 4 composers. Sakurai was so proud, he made the unusual decision to release part of the soundtrack before the game, as a free CD packaged with this very magazine. The music really is fantastic, and if you're someone who makes your own playlists of Nintendo music, Air Ride is definitely worth pillaging. Interestingly, he did the exact same thing again while this video was in production, releasing some Air Rider's tracks on the Nintendo Music app before launch. The move is still unusual. Mario Kart World's currently 3 months old, for example, and still hasn't found its way to the music app. Unfortunately, Air Ride itself wasn't well received back then, with average review scores around 6 out of 10, and only selling about 1 million copies. Compare that to Melee, which reviewed in the 9s and sold 5 times more. After that, Air Ride wouldn't get a follow-up till 4 console generations later. As we're writing this, the release of a Switch 2 sequel is imminent. Hopefully, it's received better than the original. In Nintendo Dream's 98th issue, Camelot Software's iconic Takahashi brothers talk about their work on Mario Golf and Tennis. When Nintendo makes a Mario Kart, maybe they'll go on a one-day field trip to get a feel for driving real-life go-karts. But the Takahashis take their jobs a bit more seriously. They say back when they were making Everybody's Golf for PlayStation, they trekked to America and took a class on course design from Pete Dye, one of the top 3 golf course architects in the world. Then they played golf with his son, who taught them putting physics, and later sent him in-game courses to get his professional feedback. The Takahashis don't mess around, and they used all that experience to evolve Everybody's Golf into Mario Golf, which they say turns the gentleman's sport into a party game. Then they further improved on the N64 version by getting good in real life. The brothers explain that improvements in the GameCube sequel came from them golfing a lot and learning how to actually do stuff, like put spin on a ball. Later in the interview, the magazine asks why they put, quote, that trans character in the game. They were referring to Catherine, who in the West we call Birdo. It's kind of controversial in the fandom whether she's actually trans or not, but in this interview, the Takahashi brothers do refer to her as trans. But anyway, they said there's 2 reasons they added her to the series. First, that Catherine originated in Doki Doki Panic, a game they loved, and got absorbed into the Mario universe when it transformed into Super Mario Bros. 2. But really, the main reason's because they wanted to give her some fun animations, like after she gets a hole-in-one. They also made her balls trail rainbows. She's been in every Mario Golf since, though she got demoted to an NPC in the latest Switch iteration. We've got some more new GameCube game facts coming up, but before we dive in, a word from this video's sponsor, Rocket Money. Rocket Money is an easy-to-use finance app that helps you manage your money and save more. With Rocket Money, its members have saved up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. One way Rocket Money does this, and it's something that actually saved us money, is by searching through and listing all your subscriptions. Then it lets you cancel any subscriptions you forgot about or no longer want with just a few taps. In fact, Rocket Money has saved up to $500 million in total in cancelled subscriptions. Rocket Money can also help lower your monthly costs by automatically scanning your bills for potential savings. They'll even negotiate better rates on your internet, cable, and phone bills for you. No need to make any calls, just a few taps, and they take care of the rest. Plus, they offer tools to help you stay on budget, which is super handy now that video games are $80 a pop. Oof. So if you want to save more and spend less, join the over 5 million users using Rocket Money today by scanning the QR code on the screen or using the link at the top of the video's description. So get started for free today and help support this channel in the process. Thank you for your time, and thanks to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. In Nintendo Dream's March 2003 issue, Yoshio Sakamoto and Kensuke Tanabe discuss Metroid Prime and Fusion's development. Americans remember November 18th, 2002 as the glorious day both games launched simultaneously, but in every other region, they released weeks and months apart. Today we'll mostly cover what they say about Prime and save Fusion details for a later video. Prime hit Japan 3 months after it came out in America, and Sakamoto says, quote, "We changed a lot for Prime. There were things we had to give up in order to meet the release date for the US version, and we added those in the Japanese version. Back in those days, it was usually the other way round. Americans got games later and in exchange got a more refined product. But Prime was made by Retro Studios in Texas and took months to localize for Japan." Sakamoto says they removed a lot of hints from the Japanese version because the point of Metroid is to wander around. The American version's frequent waypoints made progression quicker, but robbed players of some of Metroid's essence. He says Americans only got as many hints as they did because the US marketing staff wanted to make the game easier. The difficulty was ramped up in other ways as well. Japanese enemies had higher HP and dropped fewer items like health pickups. A lot of Nintendo games are made harder for Americans, but Prime was a rare reversal of that policy. Japan also got a 1-minute monologue from Samus that got cut from the American version.
10 years ago, below the surface of planet Zebes, the mercenaries known as space pirates were defeated by interstellar bounty hunter Samus Aran.
Sakamoto says the guys at Retro didn't like it, but because Japanese fans couldn't understand the language, to them it sounded cool. and they just kinda assumed it was good. Like when Americans watch anime in Japanese and are ill-equipped to detect weird subtleties or bad acting. Japan also made the entire game world brighter. According to Tanabe, Retro's office was dimly lit, which made their TVs look brighter. Nintendo's office was lit better, which conversely made the game look too dark. So they cranked up the in-game brightness for the Japanese version. They also changed the phase-on suit animation. The Retro guys thought Samus's hand twitching was cool, but Nintendo thought it was dumb and changed it. We checked later re-releases and noticed the Japanese animation was also used in Europe, all Wii versions, as well as Switch remasters, which means the original phase-on suit animation only ever appeared in the American version on the Cube. Putting Japanese changes aside and talking more generally, Sakamoto says he kind of felt like the series ended with Super Metroid, as the death of the final Metroid made for a fitting finale. But when they eventually decided to make Prime, he felt as long as Metroid's in the title, they had to include the titular aliens. Quote, "I was certainly concerned about that when I was making Prime, but Metroid was absolutely necessary as part of the game's title, and changing it to Samus would have been lame. Ultimately, they made it a prequel, so Metroids aren't extinct yet. But it's weird to think if they had gone the other direction and changed the franchise name to Samus." He goes on to say Retro's passion for Metroid was, quote, "insane," and that he was seriously concerned about their health. The crunch was brutal, as we discussed at length in our History of Retro Studios video. Throughout the interview, Sakamoto talks about who Samus is. In his mind, she looks a lot like Charlize Theron. As for personality, Samus isn't macho, but actually rather feminine, with a passionate heart. He says for him, Metroid's a franchise that tells the story of Samus as a person, and that if the series continues, he'd like to showcase that more in the future. That desire would ultimately lead to Other M, a game most fans didn't like, in part because they'd always thought of their silent protagonist as more stoic and badass. And finally seeing her as Sakamoto saw her kinda gave him the ick. In an interview on Shigesato Itoi's website, Miyamoto says Pikmin was mind-bendingly tricky to make because it did things no game had ever done before, and Nintendo's programmers didn't think were possible. Like dozens of characters working together to carry one large object, for example. Miyamoto says, "It was difficult to get rid of preconceived assumptions, so I forbid the team from using game industry jargon. To free their minds of what was possible and how a game's supposed to be made, he banned words like random from the job site." Quote, "I said, stop using those words. We tried to create a game without using terms like enemy, ally, or fight. If you've played Pikmin, you'll see this reflected in the game itself, where arguably you are the villain massacring local wildlife and their offspring who were just minding their own business, so you can harvest their corpses for your own personal benefit." Consistent with Miyamoto's design philosophies, he also says the story came late in the process. Like most of his works, the gameplay was cooked up first, then the simplest bit of story was wrapped around it to provide player context. Quote, "Some games go with the approach of starting with the world first, but making a game while grappling with an already established world isn't what we did with Pikmin. I wanted to create just the basic framework for Pikmin's gameplay, then figure out what kind of world would be more suitable and what would be needed as a minimum. So I added the shipwreck story because it was the simplest and easiest to understand." He wanted an isolated setting for the real-time puzzle gameplay, and a story about crash landing in space was the simplest, quickest way to make it happen. That's classic Miyamoto, and part of what sets Nintendo games apart from something like Naughty Dog's Last of Us or Bethesda's Fallout franchise. Itoi's website also has an Animal Crossing interview covering how the devs made a game that didn't fit any pre-existing genre. Games are usually made with everyone sectioned off to work individually, but for Animal Crossing, they tore down the partitions so everyone could talk to each other and exchange ideas. Then they put a big desk in the middle for everyone to gather at 5:30 and have snacks, and share some of their weirdest ideas. That's where Mr. Rossetti was born, at the snack desk. Despite all their weird stuff that did make it into the game, they say about 80% of their ideas were too dumb to include. One that barely made it in, though, was a shirt soaked in blood, but they changed its name to the Tomato Juice shirt to do away with the idea you're a murderer or something. When Animal Crossing was localized for the West, it got removed from the game entirely and replaced with the Fishbone shirt. In a 2003 issue of Nintendo Dream magazine, Hideo Kojima talks behind the scenes for Metal Gear Solid Twin Snakes. Nintendo was desperate to sign third parties at the time, and Miyamoto personally went to Kojima and asked him to make a GameCube Metal Gear. Kojima considers Miyamoto his master, so he obliged and decided to remake the PS1 original. But he gave the job of directing cutscenes to film director Ryuhei Kitamura. Kojima liked Kitamura's movies, and Kitamura liked Kojima's games, so it was a natural alliance. In this interview, Kojima says motion capture took 2 months, which is how long filming a lot of actual movies takes, and that Twin Snakes was the first video game to ever use an air ram. That's the thing that makes actors fly in the air when they get blown up. I'm sure you've seen it in action movies. Apparently air rams were too dangerous and expensive to use in Japanese films at the time, but Kojima and Kitamura were thrilled to get their hands on one. Kitamura ended up casting Kojima as an extra in his movie Azumi, as one in a group of mercenaries. Although, honestly, we watched the scene he's meant to be in 10 times, frame by frame, and we can't spot him anywhere. Maybe he got cut out in editing, or maybe we're just blind. Let us know in the comments if you can spot him. And the last magazine we'll touch on features Toshihiro Nagoshi, the director of Super Monkey Ball and F-Zero GX. He was also head of Sega's studio Amusement Vision. After Dreamcast died in 2001, Sega dropped out of the console wars and developed GameCube's only third-party launch title, Super Monkey Ball. It's actually an expanded port of an arcade game Nagoshi made the year before, simply called Monkey Ball. After launch, Sega's customer surveys revealed 60% of the people who bought Super Monkey Ball were elementary schoolers and 20% were girls. Nagoshi said it came as a huge surprise, since girls almost never make up such a large share of a game's customer base. Super Monkey Ball also established a direct relationship between Nagoshi and Nintendo. Sega had long had a strong presence in arcades, but at this point, Nintendo didn't have much to speak of. We thought bringing GameCube games into the arcade market might be an option, says Nagoshi. And I thought I might as well make a new game for it too. So Sega, Nintendo, and Namco combined forces to make the Triforce arcade system. Basically, an arcade board based on GameCube. Nagoshi pitched several ideas for Nintendo arcade games, and the one they agreed to was F-Zero, which would ultimately release on GameCube as F-Zero GX, and in arcades as F-Zero AX. Fans could use GameCube memory cards to exchange data and unlock new vehicles and racetracks in the GameCube version. GX got the highest review scores of any F-Zero ever released, and many consider AX Nintendo's best arcade game of all time. So what were Nagoshi's other pitches? He refuses to reveal details, except that none of them were Mario. But we can try and infer some possibilities. Glancing through Nintendo's portfolio of IP, Wave Race and 1080 snowboarding would have lent themselves well to arcades, but Nintendo had just released a new Wave Race and were then working on a new 1080. So a more likely candidate's probably Star Fox, and it's fascinating to think what Nagoshi could have done with the series. Unfortunately, in the GameCube era, Star Fox ended up fading into irrelevance instead. Namco announced Star Fox Assault a few years later, along with a Triforce arcade version. Star Fox AX, essentially. But the GameCube release got low reviews and sold poorly, and the arcade version never came out. On a side note, Nagoshi didn't pitch any Mario games, but Namco made Mario Kart Arcade GP for Triforce Arcade a few years later, which was fantastic and spawned a few sequels over the next decade. Gaming Press hoped they'd get ported to Wii U, but that never happened, leaving an entire subseries quarantined to arcades most of which are in Japan. Who knows, maybe someday they'll find their way to Nintendo Switch Online. As for Nagoshi, in this interview, he says he tried taking the Nintendo entrance exam so he could switch teams from Sega over to the Big N. They would have been lucky to have him, but when he found out he'd have to move to Kyoto for the job, he decided not to go through with it. After that, he created the Yakuza franchise and lots of successful sequels, then left Sega to form his own studio in 2021. Since then, he's been vocal about wanting to make a new F-Zero, but it seems Nintendo's not interested. GX remains the franchise high point, and aside from F-Zero 99, it was the last in the series ever released, over 20 years ago. Did you know Link almost used a theremin in Wind Waker instead of a baton? For 2 full hours of more GameCube trivia, click the video on screen. Or if you're in more of a Switch 1 mood, check the other video for an hour of Switch facts. Special thanks to our translator Jacob and Eurasia M for footage capture. And of course, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.